Hello, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for the webinar. Today, we explore riparian restoration using chemical-free invasive plant control. This is one of the Focus on Sustainability webinars, a series that was developed by a group of regional organizations known for their quality ecological education. By working together, the webinar series enables us to expand the reach of our individual programs to a broader audience. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're all nonprofit and largely volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, the Midwest Ecological Landscape Alliance, and Eco Landscape California. If you have questions, you may send it to us through the question window at any time during the broadcast, and questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. And now I would like to introduce our presenter, Ellen Snyder. Ellen is an independent consultant and owner of Ibis Wildlife Consulting, with more than 20 years of experience specializing in habitat planning and management, wildlife ecology, open space planning, biodiversity conservation, as well as science and nature writing. Ellen's background includes serving as Community Land Protection Specialist for the Southeast Land Trust of New Hampshire, the University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension Wildlife Specialist, and Extension Professor, and much, much more. Ellen holds degrees in wildlife management and animal ecology. She's certified as a wildlife biologist and a technical service provider for the National Resource Conservation Service. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you, Penny. Hi, everyone. This is my first presenting webinar, so hopefully it'll go smoothly. And it's a pleasure to be able to chat with you today about this project that I'm involved with several other people that I'll mention throughout the program, managing invasive plants on the Oyster River Forest, which is a 172-acre Town of Durham conservation area in Durham, New Hampshire. One of the things that I like to do first is to discuss the sort of the landscape setting of a property, because I think for me that really informs some of what we're doing on the land itself. And I can use my pointer here. So this is the Oyster River Forest conservation area in the town of Durham, New Hampshire. We're in southeastern New Hampshire. This is the Great Bay Estuary, and this is the Oyster River watershed where most of the property drains is located in. And the Oyster River drains into Great Bay, one of the 7 major rivers that drain into Great Bay. And this brownish area is the University of New Hampshire, and the darker green is all other conserved land. So you can see that there is a lot of conserved land around the Oyster River Forest and a lot of water resource issues. So this property was conserved in 2013 by the town of Durham with many partners. And some of the reasons that so many people came together to protect this piece of property was the extensive frontage on the Oyster River, almost 5,000 feet. The American brook lamprey is found in the Oyster River, which is a state endangered fish species. There's a new Town of Durham municipal well to the west of this property, which I'll show on a map. There's the Spruce Hole Bog, which is a national natural landmark, very unique feature for this part of the state. There's about 25 acres of old field habitat, which will be a lot of the focus of the rest of the talk, and which is potential habitat for the New England cottontail, which is was a candidate species for the endangered species list, but has not been listed because of all the habitat work that's been done by partners throughout New England. So as I mentioned, the property was conserved in 2013 by a range of partners, including the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, which put in a significant amount of money in large part because of the potential cottontail habitat. Again, the idea is to restore and maintain habitat for the cottontail rather than getting it listed on the Endangered Species Act, and that has been actually successful. There are no New England cottontails here yet, as far as we know, but the effort is to try and create appropriate habitat where they could either naturally be restored or perhaps occupy the habitat on their own. Some of the other funders was the State of New Hampshire, Department of Environmental Services, because of all the water quality issues. We have a state land conservation program called LCHIP, a Moose Plate program, Lamprey River Advisory Committee, the Town of Durham Conservation Fund and many individuals and foundations. So 172 acres within the Town of Durham and Seacoast, New Hampshire is pretty expensive, and that's why the number of partners were essential. And just to point out some of the key features then of property, this is Packers Falls Road. This is the entrance. This is a woods road that was in existence that goes out to the old fields, which again I'll be focusing on. This is the Oyster River. There's some trails that extend over to the University of New Hampshire. You can see the wetlands outlined here. This is Spruce Hole Bog, which again is a national natural landmark, and this is the new town municipal well. Again, lots of water resources. There's a major aquifer here, which is why they located the new well in this location. So the property was conserved in 2013, and then the Town of Durham, the Conservation Commission, hired me to write a stewardship plan, a wildlife habitat stewardship plan for the property. And one of the things that I found when I was out there, this is a picture of that field on the north end of the property that I just showed. I found a lot of invasive shrubs. And if you look out here in this picture, all of these big plants are all invasive shrubs. All these plants over here, the typical ones, multiflora rose, autumn olive, both buckthorns, and a lot of bush honeysuckle and some bittersweet around the edges. So right away, part of the effort here was to think about what to do with all these invasive shrubs, and I met with the Town of Durham and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the State of New Hampshire Fish and Game, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and their original plan was to treat all of these large invasive shrubs with herbicide, because the idea again was to get rid of the invasive shrubs and replant with native shrubs. This is about 20 acres of old field, and even though those large invasive shrubs are scattered throughout, there was a lot of invasive shrubs, and that would have been a lot of chemical application. And it would have been either cutting and letting it resprout and spraying, or spraying as it was and then probably coming back. And so I think we all felt like, wow, that's a lot of chemical application, and weren't certain of the outcome, and very close proximity to the Oyster River, which is over here to the left, and there's also a tributary that runs down the middle of the field. So we began to explore, okay, what would be some alternatives? And I'm going to diverge for a second because I'll get back to how we came to the techniques that we ended up using. When I was writing the management plan in 2014, I had met up with Mike Bald in Vermont, owner of GotWeeds, who was doing mechanical removal of invasive plants. And I had just gone out to see what he was up to and learn from him. And at the time, he was doing some wild parsnip control. So I thought, oh, that's interesting, and learned what he was doing. And about, I think it was only a week later, I came back to the Oyster River Forest and was doing my field work. And lo and behold, I found this huge stand of wild parsnip, much to my surprise. So that was our first attempt to sort of say, okay, we should do something about the wild parsnip. It's not listed as invasive in New Hampshire, but it is can be very caustic if you get the sap on your skin, in the sun especially. And it was right in the area where there was a trail through the field. And so we thought, we really should remove the wild parsnip, especially when the partners want to go in there and do some other invasive removal and some planting of native shrubs. And so I talked to the Town of Durham and the Natural Resource Conservation Service and said, hey, can we go in there and hand pull this wild parsnip? Can we bring Mike in to help me do that? And within a week, they agreed. They got some funding together, and Mike came over, and that was my first experience pulling wild parsnip. We're pretty well clothed there, which is a tribute to Mike and his careful removal of wild parsnip. And that first year in 2014, we removed over 3,700 parsnip plants. We were late in the season, so we did miss a lot, and some of the plants had gone to seed. So we knew we were going to have to come back anyway the next year, and we did that again last summer, and again pulled about 3,000 plants. There were fewer plants, and we're hoping that as the years go by, there will be fewer and fewer plants. We already have plans in place to go back next year. So one of the things about this effort, and we used a couple different techniques, one of the things we decided to do was keep the plants on site, because there was already a pretty big infestation of the parsnip, and we piled the plants that we pulled in particular spots where there was already a lot of new parsnip plants coming up. So we knew we weren't really adding to any spreading. We also tried a solarizing pad that Mike has used before. This is about a 10-foot by 25-foot piece of plastic that we covered an area that was pretty heavily infested with first-year parsnip plants. It's a biennial, so the first-year plants are small rosettes of leaves. And then we removed that, and it looked like we had pretty good control of the plants based on the lack of sprouts under the plastic compared to the number of sprouts that were coming up still around the plastic. So I think that's still an experimental technique. It takes a little bit of work, but it's worth trying in places where you have a relatively, I think, small contained area, and Mike, if he's on, could chat about that later. So one of the things, again, I also learned from Mike in terms of some of this mechanical control of invasive plants is that you really do have to be present and persistent, and if you're going to put the effort in to keep going back and checking to make sure you're getting any sprouts, you know, the seed bank is there, so we need to keep at it. And we're hoping to keep doing that at the Oyster River Forest, and hopefully over time we're going to have fewer and fewer plants, so it'll take a lot less effort. So again, that's a sort of a, I think, in addition to the actual techniques we were using to remove the parsnip, it really was a result of some networking. I had just happened to meet up with Mike, and he shared his expertise, and a tribute to the partners who were helping to fund this project that they were willing to let us do that. When Mike was out there pulling parsnip, we chatted about the old field where all those big invasive shrubs were located, including this area right here in the field. And he said, well, there's this other fellow, Gerry Hawkes in Vermont, who has this tractor that can probably do this work. And so, about a month later, Gerry came over and we talked about it, talked to the NRCS and the Town of Durham, and they agreed to try this technique because, again, the alternative was to have NRCS pay a contractor to come out and spray all of those invasive shrubs, which nobody wanted to do. So in the fall of 2014, Gerry came over with his operator, and they spent about a week removing invasive shrubs from what we call the West Field, which is about 8 to 9 acres. And you can see the tractor here. He's got a rake on the front and a rotary mower on the back. And you can see how much vegetation they remove when they do this work. And if you remember, of September 2014, it was very dry, which was actually very good for this technique because we tried to do this same kind of technique when the soils were wetter last December, and the soils were just too wet and we were getting bogged down. So the soil conditions were quite perfect for this technique. The other thing we did is there were already some native patches of native shrubs that we wanted to retain. Milkweed, we also wanted to retain milkweed, patches of dogwood, blackberry, raspberry, and such. And so what I did is I went out and flagged out those areas so that they didn't mow them down. And then they were able to get in and take all the other invasive plants out and mow down even some of the vegetation that was native, because the herbaceous material will readily grow back in after the growing season. So Gerry provided me a little video. I'm hoping this is going to work to show how his tractor works. I'm just going to play some of this.
Uprooting, shredding, and flaming. What do you move? Uprooting an autumn olive while simultaneously killing and smoothing a spot. Shredding a dense tangle of multiflora rose that has just been uprooted. Uprooting before shredding greatly reduces sprouting. Shredding a large uprooted buckthorn, roots, dirt, and all. Preparing a planting spot where a large clump of invasives have been uprooted. Nearly all spots where invasives were uprooted and shredded in September still sprout free by late May. In a few instances, surface sticks had started to resprout and reroot. At this stage, the rerooting could be easily disrupted by volunteers dislodging the stick. much more resprouting occurs when there has been no uprooting prior to shredding. A typical edge of a farm field growing.
So I don't know if you could hear all of that, but a couple of things that were interesting about this technique was that if you notice they do both an uprooting and a shredding of the invasive shrub. So he uses the rake or the mower in the back to completely uproot the existing shrub. And these are really big shrubs. There's a really big root system. And so by pulling that out, and then he backs over it and completely shreds the material. If you've ever seen a brontosaurus work where they do the big trees, it's somewhat similar in terms of the shredding, but those pieces are really big, and it does nothing in terms of the underground root system. So this technique takes out the entire root system, and as Gerry said in the video, there's very, very little, if any, resprouts because you've completely taken out the root system. Whereas if you just shred the plant, you're going to have a lot more resprouting, and we actually have that. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the east field. So one of the things that technique also did, and this is the field that they cleared over here that used to be full of invasive shrubs, if you can see it, the NRCS then paid to have a landscape crew come in and plant about 5,000 native shrubs. So they used an auger, they brought the plants in by truck, and they had a crew of about eight people go out and plant these shrubs. And here's an example of one of the spireas coming up. And here's later in the growing season where you don't really, it's a small picture, but you don't see any invasives, and you see a lot of milkweed and other vegetation that is beneficial that we wanted to keep. So here's a picture of that same this is the west field. So this was the first field that was done in September of 2014. So here's some of these big invasive shrubs that are still here. Here's an area where Gerry and his crew cleared. So they just keep moving down the field. Here's the next May, 2015. You can see some stems sticking up of the shrubs that were planted. Here's July of 2015 looking down the field, and you don't obviously see any big shrubs. And it's hard to tell, but there are really not very many resprouts of invasive shrubs. And then this is this fall, over a year later, again, you're not seeing any invasive shrubs coming in. So that field was done in the fall of 2014, and in June of 2015, the east field, which is about a little bit bigger, maybe 10 acres, was done. This is the west field here that was done in the fall of 2014, and this is the east field that was done this past June in 2015, and this is the tributary that separates the two fields. Now, and this is the work that Gerry and his crew did to remove invasive shrubs. There was also a stand of black locust, which is considered invasive, and there's still some left, but they were able to take those down using a chainsaw and the tractor as well to clear the site. And then here's a picture of the site after a little bit after the growing. It was growing back in. The interesting thing here, there's a couple things that happened in the east field. One is that for various reasons, the work had to be done in June. And it was fairly dry, so that was helpful in terms of this technique. But what I have found, and I think what we found, is that because it was done in June, there was a longer growing season after the shrubs were removed, and so there seems to be more resprouts, and the seedbed was exposed with that really long growing season. And I think there's going to be more regrowth of invasive shrubs because it was done in June, but again, we're sort of learning about that. And also, because this was in the area where we had the wild parsnip, we didn't want to do too much soil disturbance until we were able to get more of the parsnip out. So there was some of the shrubs were just shredded and not uprooted. And as Gerry had said earlier, that is not as effective as if you were able to uproot completely. So in both years, again, NRCS paid for planting of native shrubs because the idea for the New England habitat cottontail habitat is to get a lot of shrub habitat back in there, which is their preferred cover. And so these are just some of the species that they've planted in the west field and in the east field. And again, the trick will be to keep getting back in there to make sure the invasive shrubs do not get back in there. So a mix of blueberry, raspberry, some junipers, which you see here in the picture. Really a lot of low-growing and smallish native shrubs. So one of the other things we're trying to engage more volunteers in this project because they are interested in doing the work. Mostly it's fun, and volunteers can be really helpful if you can't get mechanical or chemical treatment into an area for various reasons, and if they're really small plants. The technique that Gerry Hawkes is able to use with his tractor really requires really big shrubs because it's not very effective for him to come in and remove small seedlings like this. And this is the kind of work that volunteers can do really well. So we've been working with the New England, the Stewardship Network New England to engage volunteers in some work days, and we have a plan to keep doing that next year and beyond. So some of the key messages I think from this effort is, one, there was a stewardship plan that I wrote for the town of Durham, and it was through developing that stewardship plan that we really found out the extent of invasive plants and were able to talk more about, okay, what's the plan to deal with the invasive plants, rather than simply the idea that, you know, the partners would have gone in there and sprayed the invasive shrubs and planted some natives, and that sort of would have been the, you know, the sort of the extent of the collaboration. So I think everybody's been really happy that we were able to have this stewardship plan in place. And again, it's the partnership of all the funders, and NRCS really deserves a lot of credit for providing a lot of the funding for this effort, as well as the Town of Durham Conservation Commission has contributed. And then the collaborations among the various consultants. I think we all bring something different to the effort and are willing to share our techniques and our experiences, both good and bad. We're learning from things that work and some things that don't work, and very happy to share that. Volunteers are really essential, again, to keep on top of the invasives and to fit them in where it's most effective to fit them in with the work of consultants. Persistence, this is for Mike Bald, because he's really been the one to really press the idea that you sort of have to have a long-term plan for this and an idea where it's going to go, because if you only spend a couple years on a project, the invasives are going to come back, because indeed there are invasive plants in that forest around this old field. So we're going to have to stick with this effort. And we're going to have to use multiple strategies. Again, hand pulling by consultants, hand pulling by volunteers, mechanical means that Gerry is able to employ, and we're going to try some other things. And what we have now for the next steps coming up for year 3, we're going to go in there and pull the wild parsnip again. So now we're into this riparian area. If you remember back at the map, the Oyster River about 5,000 feet along the north end, and then the tributary that divides the field. There are a lot of big invasive shrubs in there, and that's the hardest part because the soils are sensitive. We want to protect water quality. If we try to go in there really any time of year with any kind of tractor, we're going to create a mess, really. So in talking with Mike and Gerry and others, we're thinking of trying a few different techniques. Gerry Hawkes has experience with flaming invasives. He's got a built-in system on his tractor and has a wand that can go about 100 feet from the tractor, and we may try that with multiflora rose, bush honeysuckle, and barberry, where he has found that to be the most effective. We may be able to do some hand pulling for the smaller things. And Mike Bald and others have had experience with girdling buckthorn that doesn't respond very well to the flaming, so we're going to try some girdling of the buckthorn. And again, that may take a few years, but at least we're going to start knocking back those major seed sources. So the one big question we have is, if we want to stay on top of this, do we need to do any targeted chemical treatment? And in that regard, would be probably a cut stem and very targeted treatment of the more difficult to reach or difficult to control invasives. Be interested in people's thoughts on that. There are still some upland areas that would be very conducive to Gerry coming back in with his tractor to uprooting and shredding uplands. In particular, if you remember, there was a woods road that extended from the entrance of the property all the way north to the fields. There are several large invasive shrubs along that corridor, and I'd like to get those seed sources out of there so that we don't continue to spread invasives. We need to check those fields for resprouts because there are going to be some. Whether we can have volunteers pull those or whether consultants should come back in and do that, we'll see this year. And we're planning a bunch more volunteer work days, again, through the Stewardship Network New England, to have people help keep controlling the invasive plants. So those are, oh, I do want to thank all the folks who've been involved with this, Town of Durham, especially the Conservation Commission, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Rockingham County Conservation District, Mike Bald at GotWeeds, Gerry Hawkes from Forest Savers, and the many volunteers that have helped us on the project as well. So I wanted to leave quite a bit of time for questions and conversation, because again, I think a lot of this is experimental, but one of the things we feel really good about is that we were able to, I think, avoid a huge amount of use of invasive chemicals to control invasives, and instead really rely foremost on mechanical means, and only as a last resort or only in very targeted situations are we going to perhaps use chemicals. So Penny, I'm open to discussion, questions.
Okay, we do have several questions that have come in. The first question is, what was the tractor that Gerry Hawkes was using?
So I don't know if he is on today, but I don't know if I have all of his specifics, but it's a tractor that he actually sort of custom built. I got the picture back up of his tractor, but he custom built the blue parts, and I think he custom built the rake on the front, but the mower on the back is a standard mower that you can buy. So, and he's also, I don't have a picture because we didn't do it here yet, this flaming technique that he's using, he also custom built that and mounts it right on his tractor, so he can, nice thing about this is he can load this on a flatbed and pull it behind his truck and take it anywhere. So it's a very compact system, and he would, I can get people his contact information. He's got a website for, if you Google Forest Savers, and you'll be able to get a little bit more information, I think, about his actual tractor.
Okay. Do you know if he goes outside of the Vermont and New Hampshire area for consulting work such as this?
I think he would be interested. I think he'd be open to people using his technique, so I think people should definitely contact him. Yeah, he's very enthusiastic about this work. So.
Okay, the next question. Sorry, the next question is, you mentioned that black locusts were considered invasive, and this participant was curious why you think they're invasive.
Because they've been, they are sort of considered an invasive plant in some lists, and it's a watch species, so we felt if we were going to, I was going to bring up that picture where they were, we felt that if we were going to go in there, and this is again the north end, if people can still see the picture, at the north end of that east field, there's a stand of black locust, and it does have invasive tendencies, because if you look out in this field now where it's regrown, there are little seedlings of black locust, and so we were going to go in there. It was, this particular stand was, there was a complete understory of bush honeysuckle and multiflora rose, and bittersweet vines were growing up into the black locust. So it was going to be really hard to simply remove those understory invasive shrubs without dealing with the black locusts, and so we decided and Gerry was able to do it as well, because he's a forester and he can use a chainsaw, and he had no problem. If you can envision, you know, how bittersweet grows up into trees and it looks like a big jungle, he had no problem dealing with that with that small tractor. He was able to pull the bittersweet down and cut down those black locusts, and so now you can go back in and replant with native shrubs. And also one of the goals for the partners is to enlarge, if possible, enlarge the amount of old field. So removing the black locust in this situation seemed like a good idea, given that it does have invasive tendencies.
Okay. You said that removal in June resulted in more resprouting. When would you consider the best time of year to reduce resprouting?
Well, all I can do is compare the September, it was end of September when Westfield was done, the 8 acres, the Westfield, and it was very dry, and the replanting of native shrubs was in October. So it just seemed to me that the response, that the invasives did not have a chance to sort of, resprout and get a vigorous growth, because the growing season was starting to slow down at that point, whereas in June it's sort of just getting going. So we don't have any like hard data, but it was sort of just observational from what I saw looking at the response after the June treatment versus the September treatment.
Okay. How are you planning to keep the fields from succeeding to forest? Since you have all those native shrub plantings, you must not be planning to mow to manage that.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's when I said we have a plan and you have to be persistent. And this is not to criticize any of the partners or anybody, because none of us are able to sort of plan 20 years out. But I do think there does have to be plans for that sort of thing when this work is done. The only thing I can say is that these fields were probably abandoned 20 to 30 years ago, and nothing was done to them really in that 20 or 30 years. So what happened during that period is these invasive shrubs slowly came in, and it really did not succeed to forest in that time period. So I do think there's a fair bit of time to, as long as people are out there pulling any resprouts or treating any resprouts and letting the native shrubs get a hold, I don't know that the maintenance is that intensive for this site. And every site is going to be different in terms of old field habitat. So some grow really fast back to forest, and some grow more slowly. And this seems like one that's growing more slowly.
Okay. Were you concerned about causing erosion in the area that you use the tractor, especially near the tributary?
Right, good question. So I don't have a picture, I don't think I have a picture right up close to the tributary, but yeah, so what happened is so this work was done, the first field was done in, as I said, September of 2014. It was really dry. And at the time, we didn't really realize how beneficial that was. We wanted to do the other field, and Gerry thought, well, maybe we should try it later in the year when the ground starts to freeze up a bit. So we tried it in December of 2015, and that was kind of like, December of 2014, and that was kind of like this December. It was a bit tropical. So it would get cold overnight, but then it would soften up during the day, and so we attempted crossing the tributary and going over to the other side, and they started to do a little bit of work with the tractor, and it was very clear very quickly that the soils, when they had those particular soils, when they're moist, get very slick. So it's almost like it's a very, if it's dry, it's super dry, but if it's at least a bit wet, they're super soupy and slick. And so we realized really quickly that we could not work in that area unless it was really dry. You almost need like drought conditions, and then it was perfect. So so we stayed out of the really wet areas with the tractor, and that's where we are this coming year now, is to get into that riparian area, and that's why we're looking at some different strategies, such as the flame wand, where they can reach in really far, and the tractor would be out, in the on a drier piece of ground. We're going to do the girdling. We're going to do some other handwork, and that's where we're trying to decide about the chemical application of targeted plants. But it's the tractor. That tractor technique does not work on moist soils. That's definite.
Okay. Can you go over what species and what particular applications you plan to, or you already have used flaming, and how effective the flaming treatment was?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually, we have not used flaming yet. Gerry has sent me some thoughts about that because I asked him for this coming year. So these big shrubs that we have, going to put up a picture of the existing shrubs. This is not the riparian area, but the same ones are in the riparian area. So multiflora rose, barberries, and bush honeysuckles. And if you think about the growth patterns of those, Gerry said those respond very well to the flame treatment. So I think they've been using 2 treatments. So they go in and do one, and when it's all dried up and died back, they go in again, and then it really flames out the interior of the plant. He said it does not work well on buckthorn. So we're not going to even attempt to do it with the buckthorn, but we do have a lot of bush honeysuckle and multiflora rose, especially in those riparian areas. And we haven't quite figured out if we're going to go in and, we might go in and flame those. And then once those have died back, we can then go in and see where the buckthorn is and do the hand treatments with the buckthorn. But that's our plan.
Great. What did you do with the shredded debris after the tractor created all of that?
Yeah, so this was pretty amazing. So again, I don't know if folks are familiar again with the Brontosaurus, which is the big tractor-mounted mowers. They do the power lines and so forth, and they are used for early successional habitat. If you've been around those, they make really big chips. And so when you go out to an area like that, you see that you see all the debris from the trees that were shredded. This is pretty amazing. Let's see if I have a better picture up close. When you go out here after they've done their work with the tractor, you actually can barely tell that there was any kind of woody vegetation there. It does such a good job of shredding. It essentially mulches the site. And so when the landscapers came out to do their planting, this was like somebody had created a garden for them, because it was the sites were so well mulched from all that shredded debris that they were able to easily, even though they had to use an auger to make a nice, they planted obviously big pots. It was perfect for planting. So you don't do anything. It just creates mulch, and it doesn't create very thick. It's not thick because again, a lot of it was herbaceous vegetation, and then these really big shrubs. So the amount is actually, even though the shrub looks big, it ends up being a much smaller amount of debris than you would expect from, say, if you were doing big trees.
Fascinating. Slightly different direction. How do you think the process that you use would scale up to larger areas versus chemicals?
So we did this on, so the west field again was about 8 acres, and the east field was about, I think 9 to 10 acres they treated. They can, if they've got the right site, and this is a really good site. It's about a half-mile in there. So to get in there took a while to get the truck and tractor in there and get it in and out. But this was a pretty easy site to access. So they can, and again, this took about a week because it was, we were just getting going and understanding how we were going to do it here. And the other side, I think, only took about 3 or 4 days. They were really efficient. So that seems like a pretty good time, because if I imagine a herbicide applicator coming in, it would take them a long time, or you'd have to have somebody come in and first cut them, let them resprout, and then spray them. So it seems to me what we thought is this scaled really well, and you don't have any, obviously, you're not using chemicals, so there's no drift. I found with some of the backpack spraying of big shrubs that it doesn't kill them entirely, so they resprout. Whereas these, we think if you uproot and shred, you get a pretty good kill of that particular shrub. And as you can see, they're gone. They're not there, and I don't think we're going to have a lot of resprouts there, even though there's that seed bank that might still be there. So I think it scales up. It's not cheap. It's over $1,000 an acre. But again, if you factor in trying to bring in consultants to do various aspects of this, I think it's comparable and more beneficial than if we're going to use chemicals.
Could you expand a little bit on that cost? You mentioned $1,000 an acre. So what were the overall costs for the 2 different mechanical treatments on the acreage that you covered?
Yeah, so again, the biggest cost, and I don't have the actual cost for the plantings of the native shrubs. This was done by the actual landscapers. You could have volunteers do that kind of project too to reduce the cost, but I don't have the cost on the plantings. The only cost I have is for I don't have the east field in front of me, but the 8.5 acres was $1,100 per acre, $9,295 for that work, and that was about 5 days. So I don't know. I mean, again, it's a bit costly, but I think if you have the right site and somebody's focused on doing this to remove invasive shrubs, I think it's still an economical way to go, and it's even if there's some resprouts, we haven't used any chemical, so it's not like we've I don't know, it just seems like the trade-off is worth it in terms of a little bit more money perhaps, and the benefit seems to me quite good.
Good.
Well, we could, one of the things I can try to do, and maybe I can get that out to your group, Penny, I would at some point like to tally up the cost for the project in terms of, from the stewardship plan to the cost for the tractor treatment, the cost for the plantings, or any work that I did or Mike, and the volunteer, in-kind contributions of volunteers and so forth, so that we could sort of get a cost for this.
Good. In terms of volunteers, is girdling something that volunteers can do?
That's a good question. I have not done girdling with volunteers. So one of my, I've just put together a list of what I think would be good volunteer work days out here on this site for next year. And the thing that I think they can do are actually not in the field and not in the riparian area. It's more pulling buckhorn seedlings. I think the picture that I showed earlier of, I'll bring it up again. So these are, buckhorn seedlings in the white pine forest to the east of the fields, and there's some other areas around an old foundation that I think volunteers could do. I think the riparian area, I'm hoping to have a volunteer crew, but I think it needs to be a sort of a skilled, folks who've experienced with invasives, and we have folks like that around, and maybe, select 5 or 6 volunteers that could do that kind of work. I don't think you just open it up to anybody and whoever shows up does that kind of work. So I'm going to be a little more selective, I think, in terms of a volunteer crew for that effort. And the other thing is we're going to go in and walk that west field to look for any invasive resprouts. And because, volunteers may not know exactly which is a native and which is a non-native when it's small, that also may require skilled volunteers. So I think it depends on, putting the volunteers into the right project on the site. But there's always a place for volunteers, no doubt.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit more about the solarization that you did, best practices, and any lessons that you learned in that process?
Yeah, let me just bring that picture back up. Yeah, so we, so again, this was an idea that Mike brought over from some efforts he's made, and basically what we did is we looked for an area where there were a lot of first-year parsnip plants, and then he had brought a piece of plastic that, again, was about 10 feet by 25 feet. It was sort of a manageable size for the two of us, and we basically just dug it in around the edges, and the idea is, it's so hot that it kills off the plants, and I don't know. I think we have to go back out there in this next year and see what's coming up in that particular area. It seems to me like that technique would be good, like in your backyard or at the edge of a farm, somewhere where you're right there and could put it in. Where this is pretty far out in the middle of nowhere, and I mean it's out in that field, but I don't think it's a very effective technique for that particular site. I think it would be useful on a smaller scale. That's just my thoughts at this point.
Okay. Also, a question came in about a smaller scale. If you have a few bush honeysuckles or large invasive shrubs, but a small number of them that wouldn't warrant the tractor, have you had experience with non-chemical control methods that might work for that? Yeah,
I mean, I think the weed wrench, we have a picture of the weed wrench with the volunteers. If you're familiar with the weed wrenches, those are very effective. Yeah, the one here, and I know in southeast New Hampshire we have, those are available for loan for landowners. I don't know where folks are, but if you have access to them, those are very effective for any larger, like a small sapling, whether it's a bush honeysuckle or what have you, very easy to pull with a weed wrench. And actually, I find that bush honeysuckles are very easy to pull regardless. They have very weak root systems. The one that's hardest, I think, of all of these, besides bittersweet, which just spreads everywhere underground, are multiflora rose because they're so nasty. terms of getting into them. And those I think you have to sort of trim back and then get in there with a weed wrench. But very easy to control, I think, large shrubs on a small scale with those techniques.
Okay, this one goes back to planting after the tractor is finished. You mentioned that the mulch was quite fine. Do you have any information, or have you tried doing any seeding over that? Can it be seeded directly over the tractor's mulching?
I think if you wanted herbaceous material, you know, plants to come back, I don't think shrubs would be able to compete. Because if you look at, if you look at this picture here, so this is September when the work was done, and you're getting this bare soil, and then you have the planting in May. You can see where this shrub is here, and they did leave a little, the landscapers added a little bit of bulk mulch around each of their plantings. You see how dense the vegetation is even after it was cleared bare. I don't think a shrub seed would, a native shrub seed, now invasive shrub seeds seem to do pretty well, but I'm not sure that that would, that they would be able to come in and compete. Sorry.
Okay.
I just, yeah, and these are, these are probably, you know, these are gallon-sized shrubs. You could get, we have the State Forest Nursery in New Hampshire where you can buy bare rootstock, you know, 10 for $10, really cheap, and I think those would do okay here. So you could do a much cheaper thing. I think that would be more effective than seeding. Okay. Seed can be, I think seed can be pretty expensive, and you might be able to plant a little bit more densely here.
All right. Can you explain what the specific NRCS program was that you got funding from? And is it something that related directly to the New England cottontail, or is it available for other kinds of projects?
Right. So this was a Wetlands Reserve Program easement that was, which is a program of the Natural Resource Conservation Service. So they have, they call it WRE now, I think, or WREP, where they will provide funding for the acquisition, and they then hold an easement, what's called the Wetland Reserve Program easement. And whenever they do, we do a lot of those in New Hampshire. Land trusts and other partners do land conservation through NRCS using WRP, and usually they're lands, well, they are lands that have some significant water resource features, whether it's wetlands, riparian areas, and such. And if there's other values, that's even better. And so anytime you do a WRP or WRE easement with NRCS, there's always a restoration piece. Whether you're repairing erosion problems or restoring habitat, there has to be something, and often there's invasives, but usually there's some other things as well. So in this case, we had invasive plants, but there was also the focus on the New England cottontail, and NRCS is a really big partner in trying to restore New England cottontail so that it didn't get listed. And that's why there was such an interest in providing both the acquisition money to acquire the property, but then also help pay for this work. So they have, the Town of Durham paid for the stewardship plan. NRCS has paid for the all the restoration work, and the Town of Durham is hosting some of the volunteer work days and helping fund a little bit of that cost. So yes, it was really important. This work would have been much harder to do. We would have had another funding source if we didn't have the NRCS Wetlands Reserve Program easement, but that's a really good program if you're trying to conserve land and do restoration. They've been great partners.
And will there be any monitoring of the cottontail moving forward?
Yeah, so New Hampshire Fish and Game, which is the state partner on the New England cottontail in New Hampshire, is going to go out and survey for New England cottontail this winter on this particular site. You know, as one of the things that happens with wildlife is sometimes they don't care if they're natives or non-natives. We prefer to restore it to, you know, more of a natural system. But so if they're in that riparian area where there are lots of invasives that we want to take out, we may have to revise whether we're going to go in there and take out all the invasives right away. If there are no cottontails there this winter, which we don't think there necessarily are because there haven't been, then we will continue with the invasive removal. and then try to get some native. There are a lot of native plants in that riparian area. We just want to get the invasives out and then let natural vegetation come in.
Okay.
So as yet there are no cottontail, but it's within a, they're trying to make at least 30 acres of oldfield habitat right here, and then it connects to some other habitat that's potentially cottontail habitat.
Okay. Is it possible to receive a copy of the stewardship plan for Oyster River? And does it include a multi-year plan?
So yes, you can receive the plan. It's I can get the link for you, Penny, but it's also if you go to the Town of Durham, I think if you go to the Conservation Commission link, they have all the files up there on the stewardship plan. But we can also provide you a direct link there at some point. No, it's you know, again, as much as I said earlier, these partners have been great, and we're trying to plan out a year in advance. It's just really hard for anybody, whether it's a federal agency, a state agency, or a town, to project out even more than a year in terms of funding and strategy. So I think that's always going to be difficult. But one of the benefits here were there were many of us particular property, and it won't be easy to. It's a town-owned property. And it won't be easy to make sure everybody stays focused and to make sure we don't, like in 10 years, like, oh, shoot, geez, we did all that work and now we got invasive shrubs back out there. And I think that's the difficulty with invasives. It's very easy to get, you know, sidetracked onto the next thing and move on. And what we've been hoping with the Oyster River Forest is that we can continue to share what we're learning and just, you know, give our ideas about what works, what doesn't work, and we are going to have to stay with this particular property if we want to make it work.
Excellent. A couple of clarification questions. One, by bush honeysuckle, do you mean the Asian honeysuckles, or the bush honeysuckles of Deervilla?
There are a mixture of, just looking at my species list, there are several out there, and I'm just, I think they're all Lanicera, if I recall.
Okay. The next question is, can you give us a feel for which of the native shrubs have had the most success?
Yeah, good question. I don't think we've done a very good survey of those because they are, they're quite embedded in this high vegetation. It's one of the things I think we need to do next year, but we haven't, I don't think we actually have followed that very well. So it's a really good idea. And I don't really have a feel. I think the question will be, one, you know, how vigorous were the plants when they went in? It was really dry in September. We were fortunate that 2014 that it rained in October, so they got a really good amount of rainfall, and I think that really helped their success. Yeah, I mean, I think these bigger, if this is the picture when they were first planted, but I think these, you know, the bigger ones are probably going to do a little bit better, and whether there was much deer browsing, because that's a big concern up here. It's one of the reasons why the NRCS decided not to include some of the dogwoods, because apparently they are just totally succumbed to deer browsing when they've tried to plant them in the past.
Okay, so you didn't do anything to protect from deer browse?
No, I talked to the landscaper about that, and they said no, it's not worth it. They're just more any kind of, you know, tree shield would be expensive, difficult, maintenance, you know, the number of plants they put in, it just wouldn't have been that worth it. You know, it's better just to hope that, you know, with all this other vegetation coming back in and the amount of forage around there for deer is so high that hopefully there would be enough that they wouldn't be just zeroing in on these plants.
And did you do any supplemental watering with the drought this summer?
No. No, and there was June, so the work that was done, so there's no water planting, and there's Again, the interesting thing about these fields is that they're either really dry or they're pretty moist. You can see how lush the vegetation is. So it's a kind of an interesting site. And the east field that was treated by Gerry, the tractor work in June, was not replanted until the fall. So it was just replanted in October, I think. And it's just too far of a site to bring water. It's just not feasible to water each plant. So it just depends on Mother Nature to, you know, for the moisture.
Okay. Did you do anything, any other sort of site prep before you planted? Does the specific question is, when those really large shrubs were pulled out, do they leave large holes?
No, there's no holes. It's they pull the shrubs out. They go back. You know, that really fast picture of them back and forth with the tractor. It basically just refills any hole. I mean, they're big roots, but they don't leave big holes. It's not like a really big tree root. I find they're sort of bulky roots, but they're not making a big hole. So when they pull them out and they back over and they reshred, there are no holes. So they just created these really nice planting sites. Yeah.
Okay. Another.
Now, this is sorry. This was an old field. So I mean, it was like potatoes or something. So it's a really, like, there's no rocks. So this was a really good site to do this work. Now, if you've had obviously if you have a much more difficult site, it could be more problematic.
Another clarification, are you mowing around the shrubs that you've planted? Is there any mowing going on at all at this point?
No. So probably won't be any mowing for a while until these shrubs get established. And as I mentioned before, these fields were abandoned maybe 20 or 30 years ago from farming, and nobody had done anything out here, as far as we know, for like the past 10 to 20 years. I think it's probably been 20 years, and so there hasn't been a lot. There were some small pines and some small aspen that Gerry also was able to take down as part of his uprooting and shredding. So, but mostly it was invasive shrubs, and there were patches of raspberries and blackberries and some dogwoods, so I flagged those and they mowed around those. So we did leave any existing patches as best we could of native. Why mow them down when we want those back? So as best we could, we retained, but there has not been any mowing, and I don't know. It'd be a good thing to do. I like some of the questions. Well, I think next year we'll need NRCS and the town to say, what is your plan for one, monitoring for invasive plants, and two, mowing these fields.
Right. We have a couple of questions about the targeted chemical applications you're talking about. One is, what specific chemicals are you considering for the targeted applications? Another is, are you planning to mark specific invasives during the season and then go out and treat when they're dormant in the winter?
Good questions. I'm going to write them down because we haven't figured that out yet. So I'm hoping the partner, the Rockingham County Conservation District, which is one of our local partners, that actually is a partner on the project because they coordinate a lot of the work for NRCS on these kinds of projects. And they have several pesticide applicators. And I would feel comfortable that they would, we'd think about this together about, okay, what would be the best, if we're going to do it, what's the technique in terms of cut stem, chemical application, what chemicals it would be. We would require a permit. In New Hampshire, you need a DES permit for applying that close to a riparian area. So we still have a ways to go in terms of thinking that through, in terms of what we want to do. But again, I think it's just one of the strategies. And again, last resort, if this is what we need to do to not lose all the work we've done so far, then I think that's why we would go in and do that. But we haven't really figured out that. We haven't done that. We haven't figured out that yet. So, but we will before we do it. So okay. Good questions.
Have you, on this project or any other project, experimented with cutting shrubs and covering the stumps with some sort of solid smothering material, such as a bucket or something, to prevent resprouting?
No, I haven't tried that, but I think anything's worth trying. I think that would be worth trying on a smaller smaller scale. We are going to try the girdling of buckthorn, and did a little bit with Mike. He does a little bit with girdling buckthorn, just one cut. And I've read something recently where two cuts, so you do one on the stem and then you do one below, above or below that. So you've got two bands where you've girdled the tree, or girdled the buckthorn. So if anybody has an experience with that, we might want to try that, because I think one of the things is just to keep stressing. The only thing we know is that what everybody says is if you just cut the buckthorn, right, it just resprouts like more vigorously. So that technique just doesn't work. And that's why if we have to go in and cut buckthorn because it won't respond to flame treatment, we can't just cut it, because we're just going to create a mess of resprouts. So that's what we're trying to figure out, how best to treat that, and that's why we're thinking about some girdling and some maybe targeted cut stem chemical treatment.
Okay. Do you have experience with what the best solution is for autumn olive?
That, again, the only thing I've found is, because we did have some of that out there where they uprooted and shredded it, and it worked beautifully. I mean, all of these, if you want to go the chemical route, obviously you have to do the foliar sprayer cut stem, but if you want to do the mechanical route, again, that's another one where if you just cut it, it tends to just resprout. If you have a small patch, if you just keep stressing these plants, except buckthorn, I think if buckthorn you cut it, just resprouts, but autumn olive I think might respond a little bit more to stressing repeatedly. So, constant cutting back.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any experience with wisteria?
No.
Okay. This next one is a comment rather than a question. This person apparently has experience with solarization and recommends that using this treatment needs to be done at the peak of the summer, June, July, and August, and the soil must be moist for best efficacy.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is, are you seeing any resprouting of the invasive species from residual seeds after the bushes were cleared? Because you said you did this in the fall, so obviously there would have been a lot of seeds on the plants.
Right. That's what I've been actually kind of surprised. So in the west field, which is what you see here still in the pictures, we haven't combed it. That's one of the things I'm going to go do hopefully this summer, summer, is to go out and look. Because I would think we'd see quite a few if they were there, but we haven't yet. So, all of these had seed beds in them, and we're not seeing resprouts. And it could be maybe they're really, really, really small still, and we're just not seeing them. But I think where they uprooted and shredded, they also disturbed the seed bed, and these native, herbaceous vegetation has come back in. So, I don't know, we haven't seen a lot. I think we've seen more resprouts than we have coming up from the seedbed, which is interesting. I don't know.
Okay. There's been a lot of backlash in the media about the use of herbicides in conservation. Do you personally think that the lower amount of chemicals can and should be used by conservationists?
Yeah, so I don't have a ton of experience with this, but the experience I've had with chemicals, I'm not a pesticide applicator. So I've used it myself in the past, stem treatments on my own land. I found it to be very effective. Like you cut a stem and you dab it. I found it to be very effective on various invasives, including bittersweet and others. When I started doing some work and hiring pesticide applicators to do some of these bigger projects, and I went back and looked at the work, I've seen resprouts. I've seen the multiple rows resprout, bittersweet resprout. So because I think it's a matter of time, right? The amount of time going around with the spraying a shrub, you move on, you spray another one. It's it's expensive, so they move pretty quickly, and I'm not sure we're getting 100% treatment. So if we're not, and the plants resprout after chemical treatment and they're not retreated, they're eventually going to go back to their original size. So I was starting to think like, well, unless you have a really good plan, why are we putting all those chemicals out there? Because the plants are probably just going to come back. So I started to think, well, let's relook at mechanical methods, because at the very least we're not putting chemicals out there, and we're trying these mechanical means, and we're trying to prevent any erosion and being careful in how we do the mechanical treatment. And based on the work at Oyster River Forest, I've been really happy with the various techniques we've been using. I think if you're really careful with chemicals, I think they can be applied in certain situations. What I think we often do is we jump to those because we're in a hurry. We really want to get something done, and it's visually, I think, quicker to see sometimes results from the chemicals, but I'm not sure it's enduring. And that's where we're trying to do here is let's really focus on multiple strategies, multiple expertise, focused on the mechanical treatments, and then see where, if any, we need to do very targeted applications of chemicals carefully. So that's kind of the strategy I've come to.
Thank you. The next question is, did you have any trouble with pokeweed coming in on this site after the invasives were removed?
No. No, we have a lot of pokeweed in this region, and it's not seen as a problem. It's a native plant here. I mean, it does come in sort of big clumps when it does come in various places, but it's not a problem for us here.
Okay. The next question is, if there had been cottontails living in that field, would you have changed your strategy?
Yeah, so one of the original, back to the very first conversation we had out there when the folks were saying, well, we're going to, spray the shrubs, and then maybe do one field and then leave the other field for the cottontails, and then wait 5 years or 10 years for these shrubs to come in, and it's going to be a very long process, even with the chemical application. And so when we decided to go the mechanical way, we said, well, let's just go for it. There's no cottontails here, so let's just go do these fields at the same time. Retain the native shrubs that are already here, and do a really good planting, and get it ready. So if they're breeding cottontails, if they want to release them here, or if they come in on their own, then we'll be ready. So yeah, it was, I think again, it was a conversation and thinking through of what would be the best approach. I think if there were cottontails there, we wouldn't have done it. We would have left some of the native shrubs, which I don't think would have been ideal, because then we're just, we're not getting to the point we want to be very. It would have taken a lot longer, and they would have kept producing lots of seed. So I'm kind of happy in a way that there weren't any cottontails there right now. Okay.
Would this technique be successful on a site with a slope?
Yes, I think again, yeah. I mean, we have a slight slope here, really not a great slope. Slope is not a problem. Moist soils are a problem. So. And I think big rocks, I think it would be hard, hard for them to, we have a lot of rock outcrops, and I know where people are, but if you're in a very rocky site, I think that could be harder for this technique. But slope shouldn't be a big issue. Yeah.
Well, we do have a few other comments and questions left over, but we have exceeded our time limit. So thank you so much for your time, Ellen. This has been a great introduction into alternative methods for controlling invasive plants without chemicals. And I thank you for your time and inspiration. And thank you all for attending this webinar. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. And we wish you luck in all of your invasive control projects.